Hey everybody, Happy New Year guys, and this is the first video of 2024. Today we are kick-starting the new year with a very interesting video which I don't think I've actually covered before, and that is what happens when you pair the Sub Mini, which is the Sonos smallest sub, with the largest soundbar, the flagship soundbar that they have, which is the Sonos Arc. Now this is a very interesting and a very common question. Somebody will ask me how they're going to spend the next $400 that they have, given that they already have a soundbar like a Sonos Beam Gen 2 or the Sonos Arc. It could be any soundbar. I'm not specifically talking about the Sonos soundbar today. The things that I'm going to be sharing today will apply to almost any soundbars that's out in the market today. So to answer the question up front, what do you spend the next $400 on when you have a soundbar? Straight up front, get a sub. All right, now this opinion is going to differ from person to person and it depends on the taste of the individual, but for me personally, I will go for a sub before I even add on the surrounds. Now the surrounds is going to add quantity, right? Because in a sense it adds extra channels, it adds extra sound to your whole sound stage. But a sub, on the other hand, adds both quantity, more bass, and quality, because this is bass that you would never have heard. Now, because when you add surrounds, you're going to be hearing actual surrounds. But the soundbar on its own, like the Sonos Arc that we have here, actually does simulate a degree of surround sound. So you're not actually losing the actual surround, it's just not as convincing because it is not actually coming from your sides or the rear. It is just using bounced sound from the unit in front of you. So right now, at this point in time, most people aren't convinced until I will show some evidence of that. So let me go through that if you have some time. Now, today's topic isn't exactly the simplest because it talks about a technique which soundbar manufacturers uses in order to produce some decent amount of bass up to a point. Now, this is called compression. So if you got some time, stay around and I will run through even the frequency response sweep for soundbars when they are coupled with subwoofers. So first off, we have to cover what a soundbar does and how manufacturers try to coax bass out of something that is so low profile. Let's understand, the Sonos Arc has 11 drivers. That's 11 drivers, and it has 11 amplifiers. Now, this channel was actually started about 3 years ago talking about the Sonos Arc and its problem with handling the bass right from launch. The bass was a little bit wobbly, and you can hear, well, I've done numerous videos on that. I won't dig onto that topic anymore. I don't want to confuse anybody who's new to the channel. That problem doesn't exist anymore. But basically what happens is that the bass will not get enough power, right? So at the lower frequencies at about 40-50 hertz or so, you will find that the Sonos Arc wasn't allocating enough power. Now it has 11 amplifiers, but the power supply, the power draw is still from one single unit, right? And that happens when you don't have enough power. And why don't you have enough power? Because bass requires power. Now, when you pair a subwoofer with a soundbar, what happens is that the energy, the power that is required to drive the bass is no longer being produced by the soundbar. It is being offloaded to the subwoofer. So what is that compression that we were talking about? Now, in order to make small drivers, right? These are small, right? The Sonos Arc itself is 4 inches high. So you won't be fitting big drivers into any soundbar, short of the Ambio from Sennheiser from many years ago. And those are huge. Basically, they are like 8-inch soundbars. So they're not exactly the most aesthetically pleasing, nor the most convenient to place, right? Because you buy soundbars because they're slim and because they fit into your living space, not because they are hulking 8-inch height soundbars or speakers. Basically, those are just like bookshelves lying on the side, so it doesn't really make sense. Sorry, I was going way off. Now, compression. So I have to show you some charts. Now, I have done the testing on the Sonos Arc. In order to show you what compression does, what the DSP, the digital sound processor, applies, which is compression, to the soundbar, you have to take a look at the charts. Now, I have some charts here. Now, the first chart I'm going to show you is this blue and yellow. Now, the blue and yellow they are actually the Sonos Arc on its own, right? The yellow line represents the Sonos Arc at volume 30, and the blue line represents the Sonos Arc at 60 volume. Now, this entire range is the frequency response. And when you talk about frequency response, it is how loud the drivers are giving out the signals. You are applying, say, 100 dB of sound, and you expect 100 dB back at that specific frequency. It should give 100 dB, but hardware, none of the drivers, none of the amplifiers are going to give you that. So that's why you see a curve. It is not a straight line. Ideal situation is a completely straight line. You apply 100 dB at 20 Hertz, it gives you 100 dB at 20 Hertz, but not every piece of hardware is able to deliver that. That's why it dips somewhere. Now, when you look at how this frequency response chart appears, right? The yellow line is relatively flat. Now, when you increase the volume from 30 to 60, which is the blue line, you ought to have the same curve, right? Meaning to say, the sound profile should be similar. But check out the range from 100 Hertz onwards, right? That's about a 15 decibel difference between the two, right? From 100 Hertz onwards. But below 110, 120 Hertz or so, you will notice that the gap is getting smaller, right? So what that means is that when you are at volume 30, let's say at 50 Hertz, and you pull the volume up to 60, you are not getting a 15 decibel increase at 50 Hertz anymore. Now, this is compression. This is what the DSP does. The DSP will pull back the bass. So when you hear people saying pulling back the bass, the DSP pulling back the bass, this is actually what it means, because the DSP knows that the drivers and the amplifier is not going to supply enough power and energy to produce another 15 dB of sound at 20 or at 50 Hertz. So that's why it pulls it back. So at higher volumes, the more you push the soundbar on its own, the less it is capable of producing the bass at the lower range. So this is what I mean by compression. So just a very quick recap. Compression means that at some volumes, the sound is being pulled back a little bit. It doesn't follow the same curve anymore. So it is not getting the same amount of bass or treble or any frequency for the matter for the volume increase that you're putting in. So that is compression. Now, what happens when you add this Sub Mini into the equation to the Sonos Arc soundbar? So that's the curve that I'm going to be talking about next. Now, when you add a Sub Mini, it takes away the bass duties, right? The 11 amps and 11 drivers on the Sonos Arc on its own now doesn't have to put out any bass sound. It can allocate the energy and the drivers to producing the mid-range and the high range, right? The bass, the low range, is actually being offloaded to the two drivers and the two amplifiers in the much heftier and bigger drivers for the Sonos Sub Mini. Any sub for the matter, like I said. Now, this curve here, right? The red and the green. Now, the red and the green are for the same setup, the Sonos Arc with the Sonos Sub Mini. Now, you will notice right away that the red curve, the bass is no longer dropping off like in the previous curve. So the red curve is at volume 30. So what happens when you push it to volume 60? So when you push it to volume 60, you get the green curve. And what you will notice now is that the green curve, the difference between the two, the 30 decibel difference between the two, when you increase the volume, does not compress at 110, 120 Hertz anymore. The compression only starts at about 50 Hertz or so, right? So if you look at it, there's actually less of a compression. So why is there less compression? Because the bass duties are being handled by the Sub Mini now. And the Sub Mini is capable of going down to 20 over Hertz, right? And because there's more power here, because the drivers are bigger, the DSP knows it doesn't have to compress that much. So the compression happens much lower down in the range. So when you are increasing the volume from 30 to 60, in a setup where you have the Sonos Sub, you will experience less compression. the volume of bass that you're getting scales better together with the volume increases. Now, volume 60 is actually crazy loud by most standards. In fact, when I'm watching my movies, and most of the time, I'm seldom going beyond 40 even, right? So 60 is really, really loud. So between 30 and 40, you can expect that there is even less compression at volume 40. Volume 60, you start to see the compression, but most people won't be going that loud. So right now, at this point in time, you should be convinced that there is some benefit to adding a sub to any soundbar. But why am I talking about the Sonos Sub Mini today instead of a Sub Gen 3, which is bigger? Now, there are a couple of reasons, and let me just explain to you, right? I've made some pointers down, the most important being price, because the Sub Gen 3 is $800, and this Sub Mini is $429, closer to like half the price. Now, a lot of people will say that, hey, I don't want to rattle the neighbors because I'm living in an apartment with shared walls. I don't want to disturb the rest of the household. I don't want the furniture to be rattling. Now, bear in mind, when you are actually producing bass, when you're actually adding a subwoofer, you're not trying to create rattling sounds, right? Rattling is actually the last thing that you want. You don't want things to rattle. You want the bass to come across smooth and controlled. Now, I will demonstrate in a frequency response chart that even at low volumes, the sub is still going to benefit your listening experience, right? And I'll get to that chart in just a bit. Let me just go through the pointers why you would choose a Sub Mini. Because a Sub Mini, well, is mini, it's smaller, right? So if you have furniture in the house and if you are not living in a huge room and this is a relatively small room, I don't actually want to overpower the room. Now, to be fair, I have two Sub Gen 3s and Sub Gen 2 actually paired to the Sonos Arc. For most intents and purposes, I'm actually doing testing and listening, but I'm wasting all those power from the larger subs in a small room like this. I don't need the extra, so a lot of the money is actually going to waste. So if you're in a small room, the Sub Mini actually will suffice. I would say that anything south of maybe about 200 square feet, you should be good for a Sub Mini. I'm actually using a Sub Mini in a slightly larger than 250 square feet bedroom, and it has vaulted ceiling at 4 meters at some point. So it is still good, right? Granted, because it's in a bedroom, I don't push the volume very high. But like I said, even at low volumes, the sub will benefit. Well, and it definitely sounds better for music because the Sub Mini is actually a sealed design, acoustically sealed, meaning to say there aren't actually any ports on the Sub Mini for the bass to be produced, whereas the Sub Gen 3, the Sub Gen 2, and the Gen 1, actually they're all ported design, which means to say they actually have to be driven harder. Now, in order to enjoy the Sub Gen 3, you actually have to push them harder, you have to go louder. So if you're not in a situation where where it allows you to push the volume very high most of the time, the Sub Mini will actually suffice. And the last point is actually because it's not glossy. Now, if you look at the soundbars and almost every speaker, including the newest era 100 and 300 that Sonos is putting out, is in black and is in white, and none of them are glossy. But the Sonos subs, they are all glossy before the Gen 3. Actually, Gen 3 and before. So the Sub Mini is actually matte. So it fits in with the rest of the schema better, the color schema better. But that's a small point, right? I should think that the main point is suitability of the sub. Now, the keyword here is suitability. Now, it doesn't mean that you put an 18-inch sub in this small room here, you're going to enjoy things better. You are unlikely because it needs power, it needs space, it needs air to move, right? 18-inch needs to move a lot of air before you can hear and feel it. Whereas the Sub Mini, they deploy 2x6-inch drivers inside. They are a lot smaller and easier to drive, easier to get pleasure out of. So I wanted to talk to you about how the sub benefits. Now, the next chart I'm going to show you, or rather the next two charts I'm going to show you. The first one is this yellow and red chart. Now, the yellow line and the red lines, they are both at volume 30. The difference is that the red line has the sub attached to the Sonos Arc. Now, when you look at the yellow line, it is all right. It's just that from about 120 hertz downwards, the bass is dropping off, right? But when you apply a sub to it, from even 100 hertz down, it actually pushing up the bass, so you get a lot more bass response. Now bear in mind, this is volume 30, so even when you're listening at lower volumes, the sub is still working well. Now I have to also bring your attention to the rest of the frequency response curve. Why is it increased? Because the sub doesn't actually throw out any sound in above maybe even 200 hertz or so. So why did the rest of the sound curve increase in decibel output? Because the sub would have taken the bass duties away from the Sonos Arc, and the Sonos Arc is able to allocate the rest of its power to its 11 amps and 11 drivers to drive the higher frequencies from the mid-range and the high range. So as you can see, I have demonstrated to you, you will get both quantity of sound and quality of sound from a sub when you pair it with your soundbar. Any soundbar. Today I'm talking about Sonos because that's what I have at home, but it applies to any soundbar that you have. Now some of you will be saying, oh well, that's because it's volume 30, because we're not pushing the Sub Mini as yet. Now the next curve I'm going to show you, this blue and green one. Now the blue and green line, they're both for volume 60, except that the green line has the sub attached to it. So the same story applies, right? From about 120 hertz downwards, the blue line without the sub, it starts giving the bass up. But when you have the subwoofer paired to the Sonos Arc, the green line, at volume 60, it will increase its bass all the way, right? Below 120 hertz even. So you are actually getting a lot more bass out of the setup, even if you are pushing it hard at volume 60. And for the rest of the curve, you'll see that there's a slightly smaller increase in terms of the output frequencies at mid and the high range, right? So not as much. So I suspect that at volume 60, the Sonos Arc is already compressing slightly at the mid and the high range. That's why the increase isn't that much. So I've gone through the reasoning why adding a sub to a soundbar is a good idea. In this particular case, a Sub Mini together with the Sonos Arc. And I'm using this as an example. So for those of you with a Sonos Arc or even a Sonos Beam Gen 2 or the Sonos Ray, and you have no subwoofer, my recommendation is, of course, go and get a subwoofer. If the $800 Sub Gen 3 is a little bit too hard and too expensive to stomach, then you have the $400 option of a Sub Mini. Now, if you need more videos, I will leave some links here, and you can check out my extensive coverage of the Sub Mini, as well as if you want to get more out of your Sonos Arc, right? I have it here, and you want to know how to tune it, how to set it up for the best possible sound and enjoyment of your movies, then check out this other video, and I'll see you in one of those videos.